A few years ago, I was lucky enough to get tickets for the Kate Bush show when she came and toured. She does it about every 30 years. And it was an incredible show with amazing theatrics and light show and people dressed up as fish running around the theater and whatever. And reading the program on the way home, she was talking about how she got, I think it was the lighting director, to take on the show. And she said, he was, the best in the country at this. She loved his work. And she said, I was really nervous and I was asking him. And I was so relieved and pleased when he said yes. And I thought, but you're Kate Bush. Of course he said yes. But clearly, even after all that relentless success, there's a part of her that doesn't feel that she's guaranteed.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Our mission at Unmistakable Creative is to bring you conversations with insanely interesting people. But that's not all. It's also to help you become one of them. I've never met a person that doesn't have creative ideas, but I've met a lot of people who haven't figured out how to bring them to life. And even if you have very little time, no experience, and no idea where to start, with very few of the right skills and systems, you can create and sustain real progress, and I can teach you how to do that. That's one of the reasons we launched Unmistakable Prime, our monthly subscription, and for the first time, we're offering a free 2-week trial. Prime is designed to help creatives like you bring their best ideas to life. It includes all of our courses, live office hours twice a month, a book club, webinars, and an amazing community of creatives. Our members have started podcasts, landed new clients, increased their revenue, developed new skills. Every week, we hear new awesome updates from people, and there's no reason that you couldn't be next. For a limited time, you can actually try Prime for free for 2 weeks. Prices go up on March 18th, so don't wait. Go to prime.unmistakablecreative.com. Join us today. Mark, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I've actually known about your work for quite some time. I remember often reading your blog posts on Copyblogger and thinking, yeah, I love everything this guy has to say because it's so practical, which I think finding that sort of blend between practicality and creativity is something that a lot of people overlook. But before we get into all of that, I want to start by asking, where were you born and raised, and what impact did that end up having on the choices that you've made throughout your life and your career?
Well, actually, I was born just down the road from where I live. Currently, I live in Bristol in the southwest of the UK, and I was born in Bath, but I only lived in this area till I was about 3. And then we moved to North Devon, which is even further south and west and rural. So if you can picture a very green and lush and wet and rainy and hilly part of the world with some lovely beaches, that's the environment where I grew up. So it was certainly not at the center of things, even for rural England. And in terms of the impact that had, I guess I haven't thought about this really until you asked me, but maybe there's always a sense of, in these out of the way places, that, we're a bit outsiders. We're not quite at the center of things. We're not the mainstream. And actually, come to think of it, it was a real leap for me to years later make the move to London, because I had this idea that I was not going to go to London. And at some point I decided, that's a stupid mental obstacle I've put in my own way. So yeah, I think lots of great things about growing up in a rural, out-of-the-way place. Lots of nature. Ted Hughes, the UK poet laureate, lived just down the road from us. I never met him, but some of his poetry describes, particularly in a book called Moortown, describes the landscape I grew up in almost supernaturally vividly. I remember reading that book and thinking, wow, that's just literally just down the road from us, that whole landscape. And he was one of the first poets I read who inspired me to start writing poetry.
Wow. So, it's interesting. You talk about being sort of outside and on the fringes. It makes me think of Chris Sacca, the investor, who basically, when he started Lowercase Capital, instead of setting up shop in Silicon Valley, he set up shop 3.5 hours away from Silicon Valley, despite being,
really?
one of those people. And I remember him saying something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, that gave him a real edge in terms of how he chose his investments, because he said, if I knew that somebody was willing to drive 3 hours to come and pitch me to invest in their company, those were going to be very serious people. And it also kind of kept him out of the echo chamber of, being in Silicon Valley, where everybody was talking about the same things. And, and so I wonder, do you feel that gave you an advantage in any way at all, in that sense, to, enable you to stand out with your own work?
I like to think so. Yeah, I certainly think it gives you a different perspective on things, because maybe if you have grown up at the center of things, it's easy not to see the bubble. Whereas I was always very much aware that I was coming in from the outside. Another West Country poet, well, Hughes wasn't West Country, but Thomas Hardy was certainly a West Country poet. And he always used to, he very much had the outsider's take on things. And apparently, even when he was at dinner parties, he would imagine that he was a ghost and he had died and he had come back to haunt these people. And he said that gave him a very unusual perspective on the conversation, which I think helped his novel writing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's always been that sense of, there is another world to the one that we're looking at, and that there's a wider frame to this.
Yeah. So you have an unusual situation in that you bridge the gap between poetry, which, poets don't become millionaires or well off, and somehow manage to turn it into a very practical and real career that you get paid to do. How did you bridge the gap between those two things?
It took a while. For a long time, it really felt that my poetry and my career were pulling in opposite directions, because, I realized fairly early on that in one sense, it's easier for poets because we know that there's virtually no chance of making a living doing this. Yeah. Whereas, say you're a fine artist or you're a rock musician, people do get paid for that. And so there's that whole, am I going to make it in that sense? Well, that whole level of agony is taken away from poets. But of course, there's what do I do with the rest of life? And to me, the question was, how do I live a life that is compatible with poetry? Because there are certain things and situations I realized, like academia, turned out not to be compatible with writing poetry. So it took me a long time and a lot of trial and error and a bit of feedback from some of my coaches and mentors before I came across what I do today. Whereas I think I'm not making a career directly from the poetry in terms of earning a living, but because of the kind of coaching I do, the clients I work with, they're all creatives, and they all tell me some version of, well, when I saw you were a poet, I realized you would be on my wavelength. And that obviously, and that's, it goes both ways, because those are the kind of people I like to coach, who have got that imagination, who've got that sensitivity and also ambition for things more than just, external markers of success like money or fame. Yeah. So it's been a winding road, let's put it that way.
Well, we'll come back to all of this, because I know you've written quite a bit about this in the book. But talk me through the sort of first parts of your career, through the winding road, in terms of, early jobs, early things, what you learned from those, and how those have shaped where you've ended up.
Well, I started off in academia doing an English degree, and cut a long story short, didn't get the funding to continue and do a PhD, which closed off that avenue. But I'd realized by then that 3 years of reading literature and critiquing literature at university, I hardly wrote a thing. And I thought the opposite would be true. I thought all that stimulation would have helped. So that was one thing I learned, was I had to be very careful of getting too caught up in a academic critical mindset. Then I had a job in publishing, I was a CD-ROM producer back in the 90s, when this was going to be the future of multimedia. And we were basically producing encyclopedias with images and videos and text, when this in itself was an amazing thing, that you could put a whole encyclopedia with however many images and hours of film on a CD. And clearly that was a dead end in terms of the publishing industry. But it did teach me quite a bit, I think, because I was managing a team, about how to get things done, how to get things made, how to get people with different talents and personalities and motivations. And some of them were in the office, some were in different places, and actually bring that all together. So I guess that was quite a good practical education. But that didn't last long. Really, what I wanted to do was work with people and write. And at that point, that meant training as a psychotherapist. And this is really where I got going, I feel, because working in London, practicing therapy in the 90s, I got all kinds of people come in for, all the things: anxiety, depression, divorce, addictions, stopping smoking, losing weight, you name it. And yet there was one category of client who would walk through the door where there was a completely different kind of energy. And this was the novelist with writer's block, or the actor in the West End play who had stage fright, or the entrepreneur struggling with getting the business off the ground, or a film director being stressed out on set. And these were the people where I realized, wow, there's a real energy and connection. And the results that I got, I mean, I had clients walking away not only saying, thank you, you helped me, but this is amazing. I'd never realized this work was possible. And that was, that was a pretty big clue from the universe telling me, you need to do more of this. And I came to the conclusion that most of them didn't really have a mental health problem in the clinical sense, but they were creative. So they put their heart and their soul into their work. And these days, Seth Godin talks about emotional labor. It was certainly that. So I thought, well, rather than, having therapy over the door, why not call this coaching? Because that's maybe a bit more approachable. And it wasn't really the done thing in those days. I mean, coaching is much bigger and better known now. But I started calling myself a creative coach. And that was really where my coaching practice began, was saying, I'm going to dedicate certain time to providing a really specialist service for these people.
No.
Sound plays a much bigger role in our lives than most of us even are aware of. An EPOS podcast powered by audio tells stories behind the sounds we hear every day, sounds that inform, entertain, educate, get our attention, influence our behavior, and save our lives. Randy Zuckerberg and her guests explore how audio shapes our experience and how pioneers are creating the sound of the future. You know all those sounds from your devices when you're using apps or receiving text messages or anything else online? Well, it turns out somebody actually has a job doing that. Randy talks to the experts behind these sounds to find out about the work that goes into designing what she calls those sonic logos. As a podcast host, I think a lot about how sound impacts us, whether we're hearing it on a podcast or from a notification on a phone or from some app we're using. And if you want to learn more about the impact that sound has on our lives, listen and subscribe to EPOS's Powered by Audio on Acast, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a small business owner, there are all sorts of things that are necessary but take up a ton of time. Meetings, managing your finances, and dealing with payroll. As an owner, your time is valuable and you want to spend it on doing the things you're best at. If you're like me and you suck at math, chances are that payroll is probably not your best skill and there are better things you could be doing with your time. Say hello to a new way to payroll. Roll by ADP is a chat-based payroll app for small businesses. Roll truly helps you make the most of your time. It's as easy as opening the app and telling Roll to run your payroll. Less than a minute later, payroll is done and all you had to do was send a chat. Even better, Roll is smart. It learns your payroll and notifies you when it's time to run. Roll also double checks with you if something seems off so you can stay focused on running everything else. Powered by AI, Roll is more than just keep up. It learns your business and stays ahead, sending you proactive notifications when it's time to run payroll so you can stay focused on the important stuff. For a limited time, Roll's monthly fee is discounted at just $17 a month. So download the Roll by ADP app today and go to getroll.com/chat. Again, that's getroll.com/chat.
So I think that you brought up something that is, in my mind, far too often overlooked when it comes to sort of this personal development, creativity, world that we kind of live in, and that's the role that mental health plays in all of this. Because I think that one thing I wonder is creative work becomes such an integral part of who we are. And I think it's very easy for people to mix up their identity and their work. And really more than that, their self-worth and the results of their work. You find people, and I know because I've done it myself, where you're measuring your self-worth and your value as a human in, book sales and podcast downloads and things like that. And, that almost always is a recipe for disappointment and disaster. Yet, I think that it's not that people don't understand any of this stuff intellectually. I think that when something difficult happens to us in our own lives, sort of these platitudes of personal development, you kind of realize that, yes, we know that, of course, we have a choice between, reacting and responding to a crisis. But I think that when these things really hit hard in our lives, you kind of realize that so much of this is easier said than done. So one, having been in the position that you're in, I'd be curious what you'd have to say about that. But how do you get people to uncouple their sort of self-esteem and their self-worth from the results of their work? Because I feel like one common problem I've seen over and over, with my own readers is creative confidence, or a lack of it, comes up over and over as this big obstacle that stands in the way of them being able to do the things they say they want to do.
It's huge, isn't it? I like the quote from the French novelist Balzac, who said, what we do as artists is we serve up a length of our gut, and then the bourgeoisie get out their knives and forks and start cutting it to pieces. And, the thing about that, it's that visceral feeling that we identify with our work on a level that, however so supposedly self-aware or mature we are, it is part of us. And I think we have to start from a recognition of saying, well, we are coupled to it. Very often when people say, oh, well, don't take it so personally if you get rejected or criticized or it doesn't come off. Well, usually the people saying that are not creatives, because we do take it personally, and it's said with the best of intentions. And I think on one level, we have to identify, and it has to hurt, because we've got to have something at stake. If you're not playing full out, if you're not putting yourself into it, what's out there, whether it's on a page or a screen or whatever, isn't going to be authentic, isn't going to be the best that you can do. So I guess the bad news is it's always going to hurt to some degree. But I like the word you use, decouple, because I think it's necessary and possible to do that. And by the way, I get this too. Nobody gets let off. I mean, I used to go to a poetry workshop with Mimi Calvati, my poetry mentor, who gives the best feedback I've ever heard from anybody on poetry. And it was funny because we'd go around the room, and then she would critique other people's poems, and people would be a little bit resistant or not sure. And I'd be like, isn't it obvious Mimi's right? And there would be other insightful comments from the group as well. But, Mimi was really the gold standard. And yet it was amazing. Occasionally Mimi would come around to my poem, and suddenly I'd be listening to it and thinking, isn't it incredible? Today Mimi's wrong. Because I would be resisting. I wouldn't see what was obvious to people outside. So we all have to do it. But I think it's partly just practice. The more you do it, the more you put it out there, the more you get trusted feedback. And I think it's really important to know who is speaking here, what is their perspective, what's their level of expertise. And if you don't have that in your life as a creative, you have to find it. You've got to find somebody who really knows this stuff better than you and can tell you things that are very specific to your discipline. And, you've got to find the person who's willing to do that and who is also skilled at doing that. Or if they're not so skilled, you've got to be even tougher. But the more you do that, and gradually you start to build up a picture of how your work seems to other people. And another good source is the things that everybody says about it. Now, don't necessarily take it at face value. So if everybody critiques you for that thing, then it might still be a strength. But if everybody's saying it, then there's certainly something there.
Yeah.
So I think doing that and consciously putting it out there, if it helps sometimes, you might visualize decoupling. You finish a piece of work, you cut that umbilical cord and put it out into the world. But I think it starts with just recognizing it's normal, it's painful, everybody goes through it. But the more you practice, the more trusted feedback you get, the less painful it will get and the more habitual it will feel.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was watching David Letterman's show the other day, and he had Shah Rukh Khan, who, it's funny because outside of America, everybody knows who Shah Rukh Khan is. Inside of America, they've never heard of him, yet he's more famous, I think, around the world than, Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. And he's basically this cultural icon in India. And I think one of the things that struck me in the interview with Letterman was he said, I'm an incredibly insecure person. I'm like, wait a minute, you're like, legendary as far as filmmaking goes in India, and you're insecure about your art. And he said and he actually said, he said, I think there's insecurity is something all artists feel about their work. Regardless of whatever level of success they've achieved. And in my mind, now that I'm saying it out loud, I think the benefit of that is that it keeps you humble in a lot of ways to be insecure about your work. It keeps you from resting on your laurels. And then, the other thing, when you think about feedback, I was just going back through Seth Godin's book, The Practice, this morning, and he sort of makes this distinction between two types of critics: the generous critic and the anonymous one. And I get various types of feedback, as you might imagine, and I remember one woman wrote this ridiculously long email with all these criticisms of me as a person, and those emails, I'm like, great, I'm sure you spent 45 minutes on this, and I'm going to take 30 seconds to delete it, if that. Mm-hmm. Whereas, I had another listener who said, I love your show. And then I was like, okay, I should listen to what this person has to say immediately. And she pointed out something that I was doing, a verbal tick. And I remember going back and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, now I hear it every time I say it. And she was spot on. It was such a minor thing, but it made a world of difference. And so it was understanding, that the other thing about this is Ryan Holiday says this in Perennial Seller. He said, the ability to take harsh, often difficult feedback is critical. Because sometimes, when you get feedback from people who are looking out for your best interest, that feedback isn't going to always be what you want to hear.
No, it isn't. And this, again, this is why you've got to choose it with care. I love that distinction, the generous critic, because I think, think back, all my best teachers and mentors they've had that quality of generosity. I'm telling you this because I want you to get better. Not because if I don't tell you, then you won't, then you're going to be complacent. It's like, the previous classes that I'd been to before I discovered Mimi's, I went through a cycle. I would go in, I would read some work, and people would say, oh, that's good. That was a good line. I really, I was impressed with that. And I'd be sat there thinking, yeah, I know that's a good line. I'm glad you noticed. And it was just boosting my ego. And I got bored and I would leave because I wasn't being challenged and I wasn't growing. And it was one of the very first sessions I had with Mimi. She looked at me and she said, I don't get it, Mark. She said, this line is really good and this line is really good. I was thinking, yeah, I'm glad you noticed. And she said, but why don't you make the rest of the poem as good as that? And I thought, my jaw must have dropped. And I saw she was serious. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms before because I'd been was brought into the whole idea of inspiration and talent and whatever. And she was saying, no, if you're going to she said, these are two really good lines, but the rest of it is letting it down. And here's your opportunity to work. And that was when I realized I'd found my teacher.
All of that. Yeah. I think that you hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about this as work, because one thing that, I think people do is they often confuse what, is the creative life with the actual creative work. So I had a friend at a CrossFit gym that I used to go to, and he would always call me Hank Moody. Hank Moody, I don't know if you know the TV show Californication, but he's this incredibly talented writer who goes around sleeping with hundreds of women in LA, like doing all sorts of drugs. And, I was like, listen, man, my life is nowhere as near as interesting as Hank Moody's. And I don't think any writer would tell you that their life is either. But I think that's such a often overlooked distinction in doing this work.
It's not cinematic, is it?
No, far from it. My life on a daily basis is mind-numbing. If they made a movie of my daily routine, it would be, here's Srini sitting at a desk. Wow, this is the most boring movie I've ever seen.
No, it isn't. And I guess, when they do the movies, they need to sex it up and they need to, put in all the exciting bits or make them up. And we end up with a distorted image of what the creative life is like. And you can have the most dull, mundane on the surface daily routine. But actually where you're going in your imagination, to me, that is what's exciting. I think it was Flaubert who said, be regular and orderly in your life like a bourgeois so that you can be violent and original in your imagination.
Love that. Well, let's get into the ideas in the book. First and foremost, what prompted you to write this book? I mean, I know some of the background on it, having read it, but what was the genesis of this book?
It started out as a really long blog post, which I think it was back in 2017. I wrote called 21 Insights from 21 Years as a Creative Coach, when I realized that I'd been doing this for, just over 2 decades. And it felt like quite a nice opportunity to celebrate that and to look back and to say, okay, well, what have I learned from, having thousands of conversations with hundreds of people over that 21 years. And I just thought, if I had to boil this down, if I couldn't coach anybody anymore, and I just had to say, okay, well, what are the things that you would want people to get? What would those points be? And I thought, okay, let's go for 21. And I think I had candles on the, on the blog draft, and it went down really well. And people liked it, and some people were, and it was, 5,000 words or something ridiculous. And someone would say, look, this is great, man, but, can you give it to me as a PDF or a Mobi file or something? And I thought, okay, maybe I can actually do better than that. Maybe I can expand it and extend it. And I took time to go away with it and write it up. And I think I changed some of the insights in the process, but that was it. And deliberately, I made this a short book, and I wanted each chapter to be short, and I wanted to not over-explain. I wanted to give people an insight and then step out of the way and say, okay, you make what you want with that. I didn't want to have any long how-to processes in it.
Well, I don't know whether you'll consider this a compliment or an insult, but when I finished reading it, I thought, oh, you know what? I had a piece that I was writing, and it turned out to be called 21 Keys to Creative Productivity. I was like, oh, cool. I stole like an artist from Mark.
Great. Help yourself, sir.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the concepts here. I think the first thing that I highlighted that really struck me was you said, when we look at what others have achieved, it's tempting to put them on a pedestal. We say they're lucky or naturally talented or well-connected, which is a great way to distract ourselves from our own dreams. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we live in a world right now where what everybody else has achieved is on public display for us to witness. You can't go, one day on Facebook without hearing about somebody's announcement of the latest thing that they've done that's so much more amazing than what you've done. So how do you navigate that dynamic? Because I think that there's this almost natural tendency for artists to put people who they think are ahead of them on a pedestal.
Yeah, well, you see, this is where I have an advantage, because I've sat down with hundreds of creatives and, people who are in some cases intimidatingly successful. I've looked at, I know their work already sometimes, and they get in touch. And we sit down and we talk, and I hear some version of the same thing, which is, like you were saying, the example earlier on. It's amazing how much insecurity can go with ever much talent and achievement. And after hundreds of these conversations, I started to think, no, this is really a pattern. I'm seeing this, and I'm in a privileged position to be able to see this, because obviously this is not what people share with the world. And so personally, that helped me to relax about it and realize that, everybody suffers, everybody struggles, everybody's got something. So what I would say, if somebody's listening to this and you're feeling sick of the relentless tide of good news from other people on social media and other outlets, remember that's the outside, that's the end result. That's the good news that they want to share with the world. And of course, we all do when we have some good news. But I will guarantee you that there is suffering behind that facade. And if you don't believe me, then go and pick one of your favorite artists and get a biography and just see what a mess they made of so many areas of their life. Or if you get any accounts of their working process, often you'll hear about struggle, you'll hear about drafts, you'll hear being ripped up, you'll hear about rejections, you'll hear about falling on their face in auditions. And you start to get a more rounded picture, and then map that onto whatever is going out on social media, which in a lot of cases is less impressive than, your favorite artist, whoever that will be. And you can start to extrapolate from that and be a bit more realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's funny because I read Mariah Carey's biography when it came out earlier this year, and it was amazing the amount of just trauma that she had to endure early on in her life before her career took off. And you just look at that and you're like, wow, this is Mariah Carey who's sold millions of albums. This is not, what a difficult life.
Yeah, I mean, a few years ago, I was lucky enough to get tickets for the Kate Bush show when she came and toured. She does it about every 30 years. And it was an incredible show with amazing theatrics and light show and people dressed up as fish running around the theater and whatever. And reading the program on the way home, she was talking about how she got, I think it was the lighting director to take on the show. And she said, he was, the best in the country at this. She loved his work. And she said, I was really nervous and I was asking him. And I was so relieved and pleased when he said yes. And I thought, but you're Kate Bush. Of course he said yes. But clearly, even after all that relentless success, there's a part of her that doesn't feel that she's guaranteed that somebody's going to want to say yes. And I think maybe as well, just touching on what we're talking about, nobody feeling secure, I think maybe by definition this has to happen because if you're really, the great artists are the ones who are pushing the boundaries. And if you're pushing the boundaries, then wherever you are, you're literally moving into the space where you don't know. If you're secure, then you're not. You see, you're not pushing yourself. If you know that if it's guaranteed to succeed, so maybe it just goes with the territory. Yeah.
So one thing I wonder, you have been, part of this, pre-social media. I mean, you kind of predate the world we live in today. And I wonder, like, what you've seen in changes around this sort of issue of, artistic insecurity over time. Was it better before we had, these perpetual feedback loops? I mean, obviously there are certain things that are absolutely better. Like, I wouldn't be able to do what I did, I do now before all of this. And then, we have the downside of, perpetual anonymous feedback.
Yeah, actually, when you say that, it wasn't such a feature in the 90s and, early 2000s. It was, I'm not to say people still had it, but I think there was, the feedback loop was slower and there was more distance. You were looking at people on they were more over there on a pedestal, someone who'd been more of an established artist, or it would be your direct competitors. Now I would say I'm definitely seeing a lot more kind of burnout around comparisonitis, because it's in our pockets. If you've got it on your phone and you're looking at it, some people look at this stuff in bed. Can you believe that? How are you ever going to get any sleep if you're looking at your competition, so to speak, or the people who are intimidating and depressing you with their relentless achievement? That's your sacred space in bed. So if one top tip is just don't look at that stuff in bed. Put the phone somewhere else if that's preying on you. But yeah, it's definitely, people are much more conscious of, because you can see follow accounts and subscribe accounts and number of reviews on Amazon and goodness knows what. It's really out there in the numbers in a way that I think it wasn't years ago.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Ready to Trade, a new two-part series exploring the opportunities in the UK's e-commerce and healthcare sectors with business leaders in each landscape.
In the UK, we have the infrastructure, we have the connectivity, we also have the culture.
Digital is the way forward, there's no doubt, and your business needs to embrace that opportunity.
Ready to Trade is available to download and is produced by Reuters Plus in partnership with the UK's Department for International Trade.
It's not just what you sell that moves the bottom line, it's also how you upgrade the customer experience. And in a crowded marketplace where customers can go wherever they wish with the tap of a button, you need every edge you can get. Introducing Citizens Pay. It's a buy now, pay later solution that lets your shoppers get the upgrades they want right away by paying for them in smaller pieces over time. I recently used Citizens Pay to get a new top-of-the-line ergonomically designed home office chair, and I do my research, and I loved the fact that I didn't have to settle for less than the best reviewed chair on the market. I could still fit it into my monthly budget by spreading out the cost over a number of months. And when customers like me get the things they want, so does your business. More purchasing power with your business today means more customer loyalty in the long run. So while your customers enjoy their new 64-inch zillion-pixel TVs, state-of-the-art exercise equipment, and 6-burner stoves to fry, saute, and steam with perfection, you'll be enjoying a nice little boost to your bottom line. Citizens Pay. Get the power to upgrade how you do business. So last year was kind of a disaster for most of us, to put it lightly. But if there's one gift that the pandemic gave us, it was the time to express our creativity and bring our ideas to life. And no matter what 2021 holds in store, you can spend your time creating something meaningful with one of Skillshare's online classes. They have classes on illustration, graphic design, photography, writing, and so much more. If you're interested in learning a skill, Skillshare probably has a class for it. Former Unmistakable Creative guest Andy Pizza has a course titled Find Your Style, where you can discover your creative DNA and bring that thing that makes you unmistakable to your work. And Skillshare is also super affordable, especially when you compare it to some pricey in-person classes. So without breaking the bank, you can explore the things that interest you most for less than $10 a month. Explore your creativity at Skillshare.com/create and get a free trial of their premium membership. Again, that's Skillshare.com/create. So a couple of nights ago, I couldn't really sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I was struggling to put together a coherent sentence, which is really annoying considering that writing is the first thing that I do every morning. And I just felt off. Maybe you've had a night like that too, where the whole day kind of falls apart. Well, I loaded up Newcom on my phone, put on some headphones and their eye mask. 20 minutes later, I felt like I'd compensated for not getting enough sleep and somehow got this amazing power nap. Of course, it's not a substitute for getting enough sleep, but stress, sleep, recovery, whether in the gym or at work, these things really shape how we perform. And they're things you've heard every one of our podcast guests talk about. But for those days when you do wake up in a bit of a funk, Newcom can be a game changer. Newcom is the only stress management system of its kind that's clinically proven in over 1 million sessions to improve your sleep. Reduce your stress, boost your recovery without drugs or side effects. The Newcom system uses cutting-edge neuroscience and consists of 3 non-invasive and non-pharmaceutical items, all of which are included in your monthly subscription, which costs less than a daily cup of coffee. And the whole process is super easy to use and to work into your daily routine to achieve better sleep reduction and stress and boost recovery. So when you wake up in a bit of a funk, own the day with Newcom. We have a special link set up just for our listeners. Go to creativenewcom.com and get 50% off your 30-day subscription of Newcom and their money-back guarantee. Again, that's Creative Newcom, creative, Nucalm.com.
Well, I remember I had a friend who had his first book launch with a publisher, and he did relatively well. And I remember he told me, he was like, "What are you going to do the day that your book launches?" I said, "Nothing. I'm going to get up, I'm going to write 1,000 words, and I'm going to go to the beach and surf." And he literally sat in front of his desk on Amazon refreshing rankings. I was like, that's insane. As if that would make the book sales go up. You know, I think that, to me, I remember I've been working on this piece about the things I would do differently if I had started today. And one of my pieces of advice was to ignore all your metrics until there's something worth measuring, because I feel like people obsess over their metrics so much early on in the journey when those metrics are effectively meaningless. And funny enough, I still right now, I can tell you probably once every quarter how many downloads each episode has, because I have to prepare a report for our investors. But I don't spend a lot of time looking at that stuff. Like, my priority is to create, content.
And did that come naturally to you, or is that a habit you've developed?
So it's a combination of probably both, because, again, I've had the beneficiary, like yourself, you've been the beneficiary of thousands of conversations like this one, where each person has kind of taught me something. But I think that the thing that stayed with me forever was the Seth Godin quote, who said, anonymous feedback from people who I have absolutely no relationship with will cause me to do nothing but hide. And the more I thought about that, and then, talking to Cal Newport, I realized these metrics are in a large way ultimately meaningless, because nobody's going to put the number of followers you had on Twitter on your tombstone. And that kind of was just one of those things where you start to see that, wow, who really gives a shit? Like, these are all fairly meaningless metrics, and yet we assign so much value to them. And then Naval Ravikant had a really great tweet storm about this. He did this entire podcast, titled "How to Get Rich." But he said, when you obsess over this kind of stuff, you're effectively playing stupid games to collect stupid prizes. And I thought to myself, that is so true. Like, last I checked, I can't pay rent with retweets or likes on Facebook. So why would I concern myself with this?
Yeah, I think so there's a couple of things come out of this for me. One is I'm suddenly feeling very grateful that I grew up and became an adult in a time before all of this kicked off. It was a lot easier for me to have quiet time focused reading a book or writing, and for other people to practice their art without all of this. And so now I think we've got to make a conscious decision to decouple, in your word, from all of that, to have practices. I have certain times of the day when my phone is off, when it's out of reach, when I'm not allowed to look at social media or email. So it's harder, but if you can put those practices in and make those decisions and make a routine of it, you start to have large stretches of space where you're free of that stuff during the day. Mm-hmm. And to your point about, the Twitter followers not being on the tombstone, I mean, amen to that. And the obvious question there is, well, what do you want on your tombstone? And are you working on that today? Because once you're focused on that level of ambition and achievement, that's the thing that's going to bring you the fulfillment. And obviously that's the thing that creates the most resistance and fear, which is, why we're so keen to be distracted from it. But it's a great thing to really look at that big picture. And it doesn't have to be death. It can be, we're just recording this at the start of 2021. Well, the first thing I did this week was look ahead to 2022 and say, well, what do I want to have done by then? What will constitute a successful year for me, creatively, business-wise? And then I looked ahead and did it for Easter, which is an easier horizon to focus on. I thought, okay, well, what are the milestones I want to reach between now and Easter? That means it's going to be a successful and a rewarding year for me.
I appreciate the fact that you brought up a easier horizon to get your head around, because I just finished putting the final touches on this piece titled "The First 6 Weeks Could Determine How Your Year Turns Out," and it made me think about sort of the planning that we do obsessively over an entire year. And the thing we know from last year is, okay, well, planning an entire year is almost counterproductive because it's inevitable. There are going to be things that happen that we can't account for or plan for. So I like the idea of a time horizon that is very manageable. One thing that you say in the book is the rise of the creative economy in recent decades means that creativity and innovation are essential sources of competitive advantage and economic prosperity. And I think that this is really interesting because it's so nuanced. We had William Dershowitz here, who wrote a book recently called "The Death of the Artist," which really kind of
I heard that one. That was
really poked a lot of holes in the whole sort of, hey, every opportunity we have is available to anybody. Because the truth is, the internet is not a meritocracy as much as we would like it to be. In a lot of ways, I've always said, you could liken it to a developing country where a handful of, websites get the majority of the traffic. But yet, I think that what you say is also true, regardless of whether we're applying it in the context of building our own creative lives out or applying it to the sake of, getting a job working for somebody else. So 2 questions come from that. One is do you have kids? If so, what advice, would you give to them or to parents listening to this around this concept of creativity being a source of economic prosperity? And then how do you have that coexist with what William talked about in his book, and the fact that this is a life in which nothing is guaranteed and anything is possible?
Oh, great questions. So the first one's easy. Yes, I have kids, and in fact, the book is dedicated to my twins and also to my nephew. And I say in the dedication, this is dedicated to Kana, Issa, and Archie, because you will soon know more about this than I will. And, I hope there's a bit of humility in that because, we're at the beginning of a young century and it's been a wild ride so far and pretty unpredictable. So who knows how things are going to go. But, we do know that AI, automation, outsourcing, etc., means that anything that can be done by rote or even by logical data crunching is just getting gobbled up by the technology. And it's much, the thing that is likely to be the best source of competitive advantage in terms of a career or a company is, can you do something that no one else can do? And that's very often something that is being creative, being original in some way, and also can you outcare the competition, if you like? Have you got that human warmth and empathy and compassion? Because clearly that's something that we value a lot in encountering other people in the marketplace. So I would say anything that you can do to foster those qualities in your children. I'm doing my best with my children, but also at the end of the day, if they grow up and they want to do something, they want to be a mathematician or a scientist or something that is less obviously creative, I think the most important thing any parent can do is let their child be themselves. But I would certainly say that, leave the door open for creativity. And here are some, in the book, I quote some people talking about the job market, for instance, and the economy. And this is a theme I know you've written and spoken about a lot, that the safe option, the supposed secure career path is getting a lot less secure these days.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, the follow-up to that is, when you think about what William had to say about all of this, how do you have the two narratives coexist?
Well, I think you do exactly that. You have the two narratives coexist, and you don't choose one or the other because they're both true. And I think William, it was a really great conversation. He had some great, realistic, down-to-earth, grounded, hard-won wisdom to share, to say, look, just because you can... So the basic story is, on the optimistic version is, the gatekeepers have gone away. We've got these amazing digital tools and networks. So there's nothing to stop you succeeding as a creative in the 21st century. You can make work, you can share it, you can build an audience, you can grow a business or a career or whatever. And William's point, which I absolutely agree with, is saying, well, yes, you can, but so can everyone else.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's hyper-competitive. And there was one point in that conversation where he said, the artist used to be insulated from the market, by the record company or the publisher or whoever. Now it's just you and the market. And that is tough. That's somebody looking at Twitter and seeing how few followers or retweets that they've got, or how few downloads of their podcast, or how few dollars in the bank account. And I think the important thing to do is to be aware of both of these stories at once and accept that they're both true, and that then neither is the whole truth. So one thing I talked about in, I think it was the first season of my podcast, is I used the quote from Dickens where he said, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And, I think his point is that, and he was talking about Victorian London, but his point was that any time in history is going to be the best and the worst of times. So one of my projects is I'm translating Geoffrey Chaucer's long poem, Troilus and Cressida, from 14th century English. And one, sometimes I catch myself thinking, it was easier for him. He didn't have any Twitter or internet or social media or whatever. He could just sit there with his quill pen and his, on his vellum. And yet, of course, when you read about his life, yes, he was doing that, but he also had a day job that he had to do, and he was living in a gatehouse on the wall of London, and and there was no glass in the windows, and there was an open sewer on the other side. And apparently, when the Peasants' Revolt charged into London in 1381, they entered through that gate that Chaucer was living above. Now, history doesn't record whether he was there or not when they battered the door down and, fought the men at arms and charged into the city. But, I have this image of him sat there, rolling his eyes. Can't you see I'm trying to get a poem done here? And, whatever period in history you're in, there's going to be the downside and there's going to be the upside. There's going to be, you've got this great opportunity, this great intersection of technology and time and culture. And yes, there's the downside. So I think coming back to your original question, be aware of both narratives. Keep your eyes open. Look for the opportunity. Be as positive and as optimistic and as trusting and daring as you can, but also be realistic and really look at the people, look at the people in your field who are succeeding. Pick somebody who is in the same ballpark of what you want to do. Now, I'm not talking about copying their work because, as I know you've written about extensively, that doesn't work. But you can copy their business model or their career path in a sense of, well, okay, there are people, for instance, on Patreon making money from, I don't know, podcasting. Or there are people making income from selling books, self-publishing and selling books. It's not a fantasy to say that's happening. And then you learn as much as you can about that particular strategy and how viable that is and what it costs. And it will cost a lot in terms of time and effort if it's going to be worthwhile. And make the decision from there.
Yeah, I think that the thing when I think about looking at other people, I always say, you want to look at what they've done, not as a map for what you want to do, but more of as a compass. Because so often, like what this causes us to do is overlook context when we treat everybody else's advice as a map. I think the one I always harp on, and it's not because I'm a podcaster, but when I hear somebody say, "Oh, everybody should start a podcast," I'm like, that's kind of stupid because there's nothing everybody should do. And the problem is that you don't actually look at the context of what allowed somebody to achieve what they have when you just take their advice at face value. Because, like people have, whether we want to admit it or not, you read outliers, it becomes very clear that people have advantages that you can't replicate.
Yeah. And some of that is personal and some of it's social and some of it is just the time. I mean, I started my first blog in 2006, which turned out to be a great time to do it. If I was starting out now, I wouldn't start with a blog because, that moment has gone. That window of opportunity is not as wide as it once was.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you are also thinking from the standpoint of a market, because I remember Dan Kennedy saying, people have this whole follow your passion idea. He said, businesses have to be market driven. He said, I'm passionate about betting on horses, lying in a hammock and eating pizza. And my passion for those things multiplied. Nobody would pay me to do them.
Yeah, well, and it's difficult. We kind of got to square the circle here, haven't we? Because if you're not passionate about something creative, then it isn't going to work. And we know this from the research into intrinsic motivation and versus extrinsic. If you're just doing it for the money or the market opportunity, you will not be as creative as if you were doing it for the hell of it because you love it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's apparently this is one of the things I discovered in my master's. There's quite a lot of robust psychological research to support that. But of course, it's all very well saying that, but if you're a creative professional is a bit like an oxymoron. You've got to be creative, you've got to have the passion, and it's got to be professional. So there's got to be some kind of market context or professional context. And what you want to try and do is find the thing where those two intersect, the thing that you can do that other people, you can see there's enough opportunity, there's enough of a market out there, but also you've got enough passion to do it. So it's like, I could say YouTube, I look at that, I have no ambition, no interest in doing it. Whereas podcasting, I'm really passionate about it. I love the kind of the radio space people go to in their heads when they listen to just audio, where you make your own pictures in your heads and you can be in your imagination with the speaker or the music or whatever it is. I'm passionate about that in a way that I'm not passionate about video. So, some people have said, "Oh, you could do, put your podcast on YouTube, record the video as well." And I said, "Look, I just don't want to do that."
I can relate. Yeah, it's funny because to me, people had always asked, like, "Are you passionate about podcasting?" And I always say, "Well, no, not really." Like, I didn't start out passionate about it, but the more I did it, the more I found it engaging, and it evolved into somewhat of a passion. The funny thing is, I don't even listen to podcasts. I much prefer reading books, but I like creating one. That's the part that I think that to me was the thing I figured out was, what I find engaging, what I'm passionate about is using technology to make things, to express my creativity, because that's literally my default question with every single tool that I see is, oh, this is interesting. What could I make using this?
Okay, just to pick up on that last phrase, this is interesting. What could I make using this? I think that's a lovely example of you starting from curiosity, because we're talking about following your passion and intersecting that with the market, but passion rarely knocks on the front door with a big hat, with a sign on it saying "I'm your passion." It usually starts off with a bit of curiosity. It's like, for me, reading poetry and thinking, well, could I do that? And it's the same with me, blogging. When I discovered blogging through Seth Godin, read one of his ebooks back in 2005, and I was just, really, people are publishing online like that and subscribing. And, he was saying that, yeah, and this is a way you can spread your ideas around the world, and then opportunities come to you. And my previous business had been me in a telephone ringing companies up, and I didn't want to do that again. So I was just curious about this whole blogging thing. And then the more I looked into it, the more I saw the opportunity, the more passionate I became about it. So I guess you could say that's an example of the market and the passion kind of intertwining around each other.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that makes a perfect segue to talking about this whole idea of creating assets. You say that by creating an asset that will increase in value over time, this brings you opportunities and makes it easier for you to create more, earn more, and achieve more. And I feel like this message has been echoed in almost damn near every book I've read, from even 50 Cent to people like Mariah Carey. And you talk about, I think, 6 total different kinds of assets: your portfolio of creative work, your intellectual property, your social assets, your artistic reputation, your business assets, and your systemic assets. Can you expand on that? I mean, in the interest of time, I don't know how brief we can make it, but it's fine if we go over. I don't know, what your schedule is, but
I'm fine for time. I'll try and make it condensed.
Great.
So
and I thought that was so valuable.
Yeah. So this is definitely an insight that came out of the coaching practice, because I found myself talking to people. This was a different type of comparisonitis. This wasn't comparing themselves to other creatives. This was them hearing from their family about cousin George, who's doing so well in the law firm, or your sister Sue, who's a doctor. And look, why can't you be more like them? And it's very often, it's easy to track the progression of a career like that, or if you're climbing the corporate ladder. It's easy to see if you're being promoted, you're getting a raise, you've got a better office, you've got a fancier job description, you're getting, there's a lot of positive reinforcement to let you know you're making progress. And meanwhile, says the creative sat there in their, rented room looking at the laptop. What have I got to show for it? And there's nobody there. There's very few external markers to say, yeah, now you are a senior author, or you're you're an intermediate cello player, or whatever. And yet the thing that, so I thought about this. I thought, well, what is the difference between the creative who has really made progress to the point where things get that bit easier, where they're making more money, where opportunity is there for them, where they're connecting with an audience? And it struck me that I started with creative work. If you've got a portfolio of great work, that can generate money just purely from the back catalogue sales in some cases. Yeah. But also it can generate opportunity. People say, oh, you were in X show, or you've got a credit on X movie. You've worked with these other clients. You can probably do a great job for me. There's also the intellectual property aspect of that. And it struck me that these are assets in the sense of, so an asset in the the traditional accounting sense is something that you buy or you obtain or you create in order to generate ongoing value. So you might buy a property and then rent it out. You might buy a stock portfolio, and then hopefully if the market goes the right way, you get revenue back from it. And it's not a replacement for that, but it struck me that if we think about our strategy for progressing our career and also finding fulfillment in terms of creating assets, if you create great work, if you are smart about how you develop the intellectual property of that, you can also create social assets like a brand or a network or a website or a mailing list or even those social media followings. you may have an artistic reputation within your field. You may be known as the person who does great work. You may not be known so well in the general public, but people in your industry know you. And you might have business assets as well. You might have a product, you might have a company, you might have a team that you've developed. And also the biggest asset of all as a creative is you. You are the one who, you're the goose that can produce the golden eggs. All the learning, all the knowledge, all the skills, all the experience, even the suffering that you have gone through, that makes you uniquely you. And that has shaped your talent and your ability to the point where you can now do things you couldn't do 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And this is why lifelong learning and personal development, I think, is so important for a creative. And so, coming back to your original question, I always encourage clients to focus on what assets are you going to create that will put you on the map in your industry, in your artistic field. And also, this is the kind of thing that's going to want to be reflected on your tombstone. You're the person who wrote X or who produced Y. And again, this is where the market and the passion come together, because in order to create something that is going to be truly valuable and original, on some level, you're going to be passionate about that. It's going to express some deep truth about who you are as a person. And the bad news is there's no guarantee. So, I mean, we've all got plenty of, manuscripts that didn't work, or products that flopped, or audition, ideas for careers that never worked out. And the other thing is, there's on any given day, there's no external reinforcement to tell you to do that. I mean, you know this. There was the first day of writing the book. There's nobody there to say, "Go on, go for it. You can get down to well done. You did the first page." I mean, when you've published, hopefully there are people who say, "Isn't it great? You wrote a book. That's fantastic." But you've got to push on in that space where there are no guarantees and there's no external reinforcement, but you've got a hunch. I'm onto something here and I want to do it. So probably you're going to have a few prototypes and failures, in inverted commas, before you develop your first real asset. But where you want to get to is a point where you've got a decent back catalogue, a good portfolio, a good network, an audience, a brand or a reputation, and maybe you're starting to find licensing and other ways of exploiting the intellectual property. And at that point, you get up in the morning, you're a bit closer to Kate Bush, who, because she is who she is and she's done what she has done, opportunity comes to her and things get easier.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny because people always ask me about the benefits of writing a book, and I think the funny thing, and even having done this, like I for years would go, I'm unemployable, but I realize from having done the projects that I've done, having built the show that I've done, if I went now back to a corporate role, I would be able to bring so much more value that I couldn't when I was younger. But the thing that I think struck me most, I realized there's a very high possibility that I'll never get to do another book with a publisher again, but the greatest value that came from that process was to be able to look at a very, very ambiguous idea, work on it for a really long time, and transform it into a reality. And I thought, well, that's a skill you can apply to damn near anything. So, it's funny because, you just gave me an idea for another blog post about the, two types of assets that creatives should have, tangible and intangible. And I think that intangible assets are the ones that we tend to really undervalue. I was talking to this woman yesterday who was in one of our Unmistakable Prime coaching program, and it turned out that she was the brand manager for the American Marketing Association. And I was like, do you have any idea how valuable your knowledge is? It was like, wait a minute, seriously? I was like, you should be teaching courses for us. Literally, and the thing is, we tend to overlook that so often. We overlook the intangible assets because we focus so much on the tangible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I overlooked my poetry for years. I remember talking to Peleg Top, my coach, one day, and he was going, "Why don't you talk about your poetry more?" And I was like, "Well, most people aren't really interested in poetry." And he looked at me, he said, "You don't want most people as your clients, do you?" He said, "What do your clients think?" I said, "Oh, they think it's cool because, it tells them I'm on the same wavelength as them and we're going to relate. And, I'm not going to be that kind of corporate coach." And he said, "Well, so what's the problem?" And the penny dropped for me there. This was something that had been under my nose for years that, I'd overlooked because it was just what I do. So if you're listening to this, maybe do a bit of an inventory. What do you have in terms of different types of work that you've done, even stuff that you haven't necessarily shared with the world? Network, audience, reputation, who knows your name and has good associations with it. There may well be stuff in there that you can now start to leverage in your career.
Yeah. Well, let's finish here. I want to talk about this one last piece, which is the whole idea of the inner critic, because I think that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I'd seen over and over from people in our own audience, my readers, was this fear and lack of creative confidence. And you say your inner critic is your own critical faculty, which is essential to producing great work. It's the part of you that can appraise a piece of work and tell you what works and what doesn't and why. Now, I think that, working with your inner critic is a lifelong battle for any creative, understanding when to take it seriously and when to think realize it's full of shit. How do you figure out those two? Like how do you figure out when to listen and when not to?
This is something else I learned from Mimi. In fact, credit where credit's due. Mimi Calvati, my poetry tutor, she's the one where I picked up that phrase critical faculty. She once taught us a whole year-long course on using your critical faculty as part of your creative process. And she said one day, the art of this is to have an inner critic who's got really, really high standards, but who's also incredibly nice and generous and cares about you. And really, that's actually herself she's describing there. And so if you have a generous critic in your life, model them. Use that as a way of thinking about your work. Ask, what would so-and-so say about this work? Because usually they would say it in a kinder tone of voice than your habitual critic would say. If you don't have that, then just, use some imagination. But where we want to get to is just appreciate what your critic gives you. And I'm not talking about when it tells you that, you're a useless piece of whatever and you're, messing up your life. Not about when you turn it on yourself. So the analogy I use is like a sushi chef in a restaurant in Japan. And the knife is incredibly sharp. These knives are so sharp, they'll take your finger off as soon as you brush against them. And what the chef does is and it nearly always is a he for various reasons in Japan, he uses that very, very mindfully and carefully in his work. And then he puts it on the wall, or he puts it in the block, and he leaves it at work and he goes home. He doesn't go and stick it in his back pocket or in his bag and then saunter down the street. He doesn't start waving it about to gesture with when he's having a drink with friends or dinner with his family. And yet that's effectively what we do as creatives. We've got the critic with us constantly. It's like the knife is out all the time. And really, you only need it when it's time to focus on the work. And at that point, it becomes incredibly valuable. And, again, this is one thing I've noticed about every creative I've coached who's working at a high level has a super sharp critic. Because it's necessary. We need that level of discernment and awareness about our own work in order to produce something good. Because we only have to look on certain parts of the internet to see all the mediocre stuff that is produced by people who don't have a very active inner critic. So this is why I say we should be grateful for the critic, but we should use it very wisely and according to context.
I love that. Wow. Well, this has been fantastic. So I have one final question, which I know you've heard me ask, and it's how we finish all of our interviews. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
When I hear that question, I think of a poem by Jenrod Manley Hopkins, where he starts off talking about a kingfisher, but then he extends it to all creatures, and I think he includes humans in this as well. And he says each one of them selves, and he uses selving as a verb here. They do themselves. And he says, what I do is me, for this I came. And it's that sense of, when you look at animals, birds, in the natural world, or when you look at somebody who's totally involved and present in their work, they're totally themselves. And I think we all have moments like this And that's when we're unmistakable. That's when we're doing the thing that only we can do. And I would say, and you feel it, I think all of us as creatives, at some point, we surprise ourselves. We start writing and then suddenly we realize the page is covered and we've gone somewhere in our imagination we didn't expect. Or, I don't know, we're dancing and somehow there's an effortless quality and we've done the routine in a way that we've never done it before. And we feel that in our bones. And so I would say if you're listening to this, watch out for those moments where you surprise yourself, where you kind of get out of your own way on one level, and in another level, you step into your skin as if for the first time. And pay attention to them because they're clues for when you're being unmistakable.
Amazing. Wow. Well, I have enjoyed our conversation so much and learned so much from you. Where can people find out more about you, your work, the book, and everything else that you're up to?
So my website for creatives is lateralaction.com, and you can find out about my podcast, 21st Century Creative, is there. All my books are there, including the one we've been talking about today, which is 21 Insights for 21st Century Creatives. And you can also find out about my coaching service there. So I work with high-achieving creatives who are mid-career onwards, who really want to step things up and make big changes. So if that sounds like you, go along to the coaching section of the site, and I have a set of questions for you to answer, and then we can talk.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
At Traditional Medicinals, we believe that nature knows best. That's why we use medicinal-grade herbs like echinacea to support your immune system, eucalyptus to help give you a breath of fresh air, and ginger to promote healthy digestion. Every which way we turn, Mother Nature is there to greet us with her amazing healing plants. Visit traditionalmedicinals.com and use code WELL20 to see what makes our teas so incredible.